Folks, this is lesson 3. It is entitled Jesus the Composer, but really it also could be entitled Buddha the Composer, Abraham the Composer, and as I said in the introduction, Abraham is my name for the person who wrote the Abraham sections of Genesis. It also could apply to Eve, and Eve again is my name for the person who wrote the Garden of Eden allegory. If you want a summary of this lesson and all the lessons, the best textbook is the one you can see on my website, www.7771.org. It's called The Second Coming of Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus. It's the first time that anyone, to my knowledge, has brought together all 4 of those people to show that they were teaching one way, and that way is out of religion. To understand how Jesus came to that conclusion, I want to explain his life, not from a historical point of view. I'll use history to some degree, but from a logical point of view. What's common sense about what happened? We learned in the last session, in session 2, that Paul changed history. He completely negated Jesus' teaching. He changed Jesus' teaching. He tried to change the historical Jesus. That continued long after Paul. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I'm going to explain in these lessons, also changed the history about Jesus. They did it in order to emphasize their message, just like Paul wanted to emphasize his message. So let's start just kind of between you and me, talking about, in a common sense way, talking about the birth and life of Jesus, and I'm going to bring in notes about how that applies to Buddha, Abraham, and Eve. Mary, Jesus' mother, was impregnated in about 3 BCE. At that time, she was living in a small village of about 200 people who were very systematically organized around Torah law. Torah law told them how to talk to each other, how to pray, how to interact, what their diet was. It was a highly prescribed community. Everybody knew everybody else's business. In 3 BC, when Mary was impregnated, there was a major uprising. It happened before and it continued after. A group of people called Zealots, Jews, rose up in rebellion against Rome. Rome retaliated massively. There were people crucified up and down the roads around Nazareth. So the phrase born of a virgin is a metaphor. It was applied to many people, including Julius Caesar. It meant really that God was with them from birth. It doesn't mean that the person was actually born of a virgin. The second reason to believe that it isn't true is that Jesus never mentioned it, his family never mentioned it, James's brother, who was the head of the Jerusalem community after Jesus died, never mentioned that Jesus was born of a virgin. So there's no reason to believe that that happened. If that didn't happen, what happened? There's only 2 alternatives. Mary had an illicit a relationship with some boy or man and became impregnated, which is very unlikely in a highly prescribed community like Nazareth. The most obvious or the most likely way that Mary became impregnated is that she was raped, perhaps by a Roman soldier. If a Roman soldier raped a young girl, what recourse do her parents have? I mean, there's no police force. The Roman army is there. So she could have been raped by one person. She could have been gang raped. We don't know. But we do know that once a woman is raped, in a highly Orthodox Jewish community, they're considered dirty. They're not clean. So what happened after Mary was impregnated is that her parents sent her 80 miles away to live with a family that was headed by two people. The woman was called Elizabeth, the man was Zachary. We don't know the relationship of these two people to Mary or to her family, but it's highly odd that a woman who is 14 impregnated is immediately shuttled out of the community. It sounds like they were trying to cover it up, that it was embarrassment, that it was causing a problem. So Mary, somehow, we don't know whether she went with Joseph, who we are told that she was engaged to, or whether she went alone, or not went with somebody else, 80 miles to live with this couple. Now, in one of the Gospels, it says that the author says that she returned to Nazareth after 3 months. I think common sense would tell us that that didn't happen. You don't leave a community that considers you dirty and then turn around and come right back to it. She probably came to term her 9 months with Elizabeth and Zachary. Now, at some point, Joseph shows up. Now, did Joseph marry Mary before she went up to Elizabeth and Zachary, or after she got there? What was Joseph? Who was Joseph? We don't know. He seems to have been an elderly man, relatively elderly. Perhaps his wife died, and perhaps he was a member of, he was a friend of the family, and he wanted to help out by taking some of the stigma away from the pregnancy. In any case, two of the Gospels have Jesus and Joseph, or Mary and Joseph, going to Bethlehem, and Mary giving birth to Jesus in a manger. Now, that's very odd. It's only in two Gospels. It's not in any of the other Gospels. Jesus never mentions it. Paul never mentions it. And Bethlehem is only about a 4-hour walk from the house of Zachary and Elizabeth. Now, that's crazy to think that they would be having a birth of a baby in a strange town in dirty conditions, when the family where she's been living for 9 months is just a couple of hours away. So my hunch is that the story that we've been raised with, shepherds singing in the fields, Mary and Joseph being denied access to an inn, they being put into that she gave birth in a manger, is all fiction. And it was done there primarily because in the Old Testament, there's a few lines that indicate, if you read them a certain way, that the Messiah is going to be from Bethlehem. Now, so the evangelists, two of the evangelists, Luke and Matthew, probably wanted to show historically, they changed that Jesus was the Messiah. They put in the scene from Bethlehem to make that appear to be correct. And again, they changed history, just like Paul did. Now, we might ask, what happened to Jesus after he was born? Where did they live? Suddenly, Joseph drops out of the text. Joseph just seems to disappear. Jesus never mentions that Joseph, which is strange. We have this image of Jesus working along in the workshop next to Joseph, when that maybe never happened. It seems that we know later that Mary married Joseph's brother, Clopas. That means that Joseph died, perhaps soon after Jesus' birth. With Clopas, Mary had 4 more boys and at least 2 girls. So there were at least 7 people in Jesus' family. And the question is, where did they live? Now we've got to use what I would, there's no historical record of where he lived when he grew up, but I think we can use logic to pin it down. And here's how, and let me do that. Let me explain the way that people composed wisdoms, parables, and sayings and poems. Since the beginning of mankind, up until the time of Jesus, people were composing poems, parables, sayings in their head. They would compose in their head. They would memorize. They would edit. They'd memorize what they composed. They would edit in their head. Then they would recite those compositions to other people. They, in turn, would say, well, why don't you change this to this, and why don't you do this? And they would discuss it. And then the man would go back and alone, or the woman, and edit the composition in his or her head. Finally, it would be recited in its final form to people to memorize. Now, it's hard for us to understand that in an oral culture where you don't have written materials, you don't have TV, you don't have newspapers, you don't have magazines, you don't have books, that people developed an incredible memory, ability to memorize. It was thought that people at the time of Jesus could easily memorize the entire Old Testament. Today, people can memorize the entire Quran. Muslims do that. Well, historically, before Jesus, everybody was memorizing not only the Old Testament, but also all the other wisdom stories that came to them. They carried their library around in their head. That's an incredible, that's better than the internet. They didn't have to go to a library. It was all there. They sat around at night around the campfire and had very interesting discussions because everybody could remember all the stories, and they could compare the stories, and they could discuss what a story meant. And they recited it to their children, and the children memorized the stories. It was a very vibrant, an oral culture is very vibrant. Now, the people at the time of Jesus and the time of Buddha, and in fact, since the beginning of mankind, had the same problems we have. They had the same worries, they had the same concerns. In fact, they had more worries than we do because the tribe next to them, if they ran out of resources, could attack. So they were constantly living in semi-fear of being overrun by by a neighboring group of people. How did they cope? How did they find happiness in such a precarious situations? Well, they turned to 2 sources. One source was religion, which gave them answers, and the other source was wisdom literature. The wisdom literature that they memorized was very much like our self-help books. That taught them how to be peaceful when they were full of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, when they were happy, when they were full of joy. How do they live their life? They are asking the same questions we are. Now, Jesus grew up in that environment, and he had to make a choice. Is he going to be a person who composes out of religion and becomes a cleric, or is he going to be a wisdom composer? We now know that he chose the latter. Now, when did he start composing? And where did he start composing? Well, in order to compose wisdom literature, you had to have know the previous works, wisdom works. So he had to memorize the Old Testament. He also had to understand the Old Testament in the way that my book presents it. Here's a picture of it. I explained in the introduction that this book, entitled The Semitic Secret, and as you're looking at it, you can see that a section from the Gospel of Mark. That beginning section, you'll notice, is in parallel columns, and each column is a stanza. That's the way most of the Bible is written. It is not written in horizontal paragraphs like we see in our current Bibles. It was not divided up into chapter and verses like we see in our current Bibles. I was able to use the works of other people, discoveries of other researchers, and I discovered more and was able to discern all of the, or most anyway, of the principles that these writers, Semitic writers, were using. The Semites were the Hebrews, they were Arabs, they were Babylonians, they were people whose language derived from Sanskrit. Now, so Jesus had to learn not only the Old Testament, he had to learn this sophisticated method of composition. He had to have done that with very learned rabbis. Very learned rabbis are not in Nazareth. They wouldn't go there. They would be in a larger city. So logically, that tells us that Jesus was either in a larger city. Jesus also, we know, had disciples that came from Capernaum, in the area of Capernaum. Now, that's on the north side of the Sea of Galilee, and here's a map that shows it. You can see that on this map that there's major highways crossing right there at Capernaum. Capernaum was a city that provided provisions for people passing down these highways. The highways went north to Damascus and then east, or they went directly east from Capernaum. So down that highway would come Buddhist monks and wisdom composers from all kinds of cultures in the East, Hindus and many other smaller groups. So Capernaum, it seems to me, is where Jesus grew up. He had a large community. There was a large synagogue there. He had access to wise people coming down the highway. Now, Jesus ended up composing, I would guess, over 150 sayings, parables, and poems. In the Gospel of Thomas, which I introduced in the introduction, I showed that I used Semitic parallelism, the method in the book, The Semitic Secret, to discern in the Gospel of Thomas that it is made up of 26 highly organized chapters. Now, in each chapter is highly organized wisdom poems. And then at the end, I present 14 reasons to believe that Jesus composed the Gospel of Thomas. Now, when Jesus went out on the road when he was 30 years old, he went out with a large body of work that he had already completed. Now, you don't complete that in a couple of years. Here's my theory, and it's just mine. Jesus was a kind of Mozart. Mozart was a child prodigy who, when he was 4 or 5 years old, began to compose his music. I think it's highly likely that Jesus was 4 or 5 years old when he discovered the way out of religion and the way to global and personal health. He began to write his first poems probably very early, and then graduated to parables. We have an image of him working his whole life as a builder. That doesn't make sense. Mozart could not work as a builder all day long and then compose his music at night. He'd be too tired. I suspect that that was the case of Jesus. Now, how did Jesus earn a living? If you've got a young man who is turning out incredible poems, wisdom poems, and then maybe even later, by the time he's 10 or 12, turning out parables, people are going to be amazed. They will come to him, they will ask him to recite his most recent poems. They'll probably give him a tip, or they'll probably pay him. My hunch is that he was earning his living by composing and reciting. He was also going down on the road and meeting these monks from the East and memorizing their works. They would memorize Jesus' works, and they would take Jesus' works with them as they went to Jerusalem or Alexandria or to Rome. In short, we think of Jesus as showing up in the world when he was at the age of 30, just out of nowhere, when in fact, all of his life, his poems had been memorized by traders, by monks, by everyone, recited to other people, who recited them to other people, and Jesus' works were probably all over the Roman Empire. That's why when he went out to on his mission when he was 30 years old, he attracted large crowds. They'd already heard about him. That's also why all of the clerics, the Jewish clerics, were so angry with him. They had heard about him all over Israel. And they knew that he was leading people out of Judaism and onto his wisdom way. And they didn't like it. They were losing control of the people. Jesus was freeing people from doctrine, and they wanted them to conform to doctrine, and that way they could control them. So now to apply that to Buddha. Buddha also at a young age discovered the same way that Jesus did, the way out of religion and the way to personal and global peace. He also composed in his head, edited in his head, recited to others, re-edited in his head, and then recited them to others who memorized his works and passed them on. Unfortunately, Buddha's poems were never written down right after he died. It was about 300 years after he died, so we have a very incomplete compilation of his early works. But he was using the same method that Jesus was. Abraham was doing the same thing. Eve was doing the same thing. So in understanding Jesus, we can understand what all the previous wisdom writers were doing. They were extraordinary people. They would go out in the streets and they'd look at people and they would see things that other people were not seeing. They would see what was going on in their interactions, and then they would articulate that in their poems. And what I said is that in the introduction is that all four of them, Eve, Abraham, Buddha, and Jesus, all four of them recognized that there were only two ways to live, two fundamental ways to live. And Buddha called them the way of light and the way of darkness. Jesus called it the way of life and the way of death. Buddha also called it the way of life and the way of death, and so did Eve. Abraham called one the promised land, and he called the other one the foreign land. So what we're doing in these lessons is learning those two ways, learning the principles of the two ways, learning how to live them. And I'm hoping that this lesson helps you to understand what these people went through in order to provide this information to you. That ends lesson 3, folks. It was about Jesus as a composer, but indirectly it was about how Buddha, Abraham, and Eve composed, and about the oral tradition and how wisdom circulated. I would hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, click on like below. If you have comments or questions, write them below. Be sure to sign up on the website, www.7771.org, if you want email responses to the questions and comments. There you can also read parts of the book free. Also, for your homework, I'd like you to think through the issues yourself about Jesus and about his life. Do you think that I'm correct in my kind of estimation, so to speak, of what his life was about? Or do you think there was a different story? But really, I want to present what I think and then want you to decide what you think. And maybe you want to discuss it with someone else. So I look forward to meeting you again in lesson 4. Thank you for being with me today, and I enjoyed it.